Have you ever had like an idea that just gets stuck in your head? Like it won't go away.
Yeah.
Almost like it's taken root in there.
Yeah.
It makes me think of that scene in Inception.
Right.
Where they're talking about ideas being like parasites.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder if there are like bad ideas out there that can actually infect us. What do you think?
I think that's a great question and a really interesting place to start this deep dive.
Okay.
Because the book that we're looking at today, The Parasitic Mind by Gad Saad, argues that certain ideologies can actually spread like mental viruses.
Mm.
And they can affect everything from our universities to our social media to like what we see online every day.
It's kind of creepy when you think about it like that.
It is.
Before we get into all the details of idea pathogens,
Okay.
I just have to mention this other book that I came across called The Mind Parasites.
Mm-hmm.
It's fiction,
Okay.
but it's about literal parasitic creatures that are controlling human minds.
Wow.
I don't know, it kind of sets the mood, don't you think?
It really does. And it's really interesting how fiction can sometimes kind of foreshadow real-life concerns.
Yeah.
And when you think about those mind-controlling parasites, that's a pretty vivid image.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think it's not that far off from what Saad is talking about in his book.
So for our listener, let's just break it down.
Yeah.
What exactly are idea pathogens? Like, how would you define one?
So imagine ideas that spread from person to person, kind of like a virus.
Okay.
But instead of making you physically sick, they're actually distorting your thinking, your values, even your perception of reality. Like they hijack your reasoning.
So you're saying it's not an actual brain parasite like in that fiction book.
Right.
But the idea itself, just the idea of it, can burrow in and mess with your thoughts.
That's exactly right. And Saad uses that metaphor to show how certain ideas can take root and influence our behavior, sometimes in really harmful ways. And he argues that they exploit what we call cognitive biases, which are those mental shortcuts that we all take to make us more susceptible to their influence.
So it's like these ideas are playing on our weaknesses.
Yeah.
Like our tendency to jump to conclusions or follow the crowd.
Exactly.
And that's how they get us to buy into them.
Yeah. And what's tricky is that these ideas often come disguised as something positive, appealing to our sense of fairness or justice.
Okay.
And that actually makes them even harder to spot.
So what are some real-life examples of these idea pathogens? Like what should our listener be watching out for in their everyday life?
So Saad outlines a bunch of different ones in his book.
Okay.
Things like postmodernism, but when it's taken to an extreme.
Yeah.
Radical activism that shuts down debate.
Right.
Identity politics that focus on division rather than our shared humanity.
Yeah, I can see that.
He also talks about cancel culture, which is the idea that we should publicly shame and ostracize anyone who says something that's deemed offensive.
It feels like we're seeing that cancel culture play out more and more these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
But how does something like postmodernism, which is about questioning established norms, become like an idea pathogen?
Right.
Isn't questioning things a good thing?
It absolutely is a good thing.
Okay.
But Saad argues that postmodernism, when it's taken too far, can actually lead to a kind of intellectual nihilism where there's no objective truth and only subjective interpretations.
But are you saying it becomes a problem when it's used to dismiss facts or evidence?
Yeah.
Just because somebody has a different interpretation?
Exactly. And that can be really dangerous, especially with how quickly information spreads online these days.
Yeah.
It can create a breeding ground for conspiracy theories and ideologies that are really harmful. Because if everyone's truth is equally valid, how do we even have a productive conversation?
Right.
How do we tell what's real and what's not?
That's a great point. It almost feels like we need like a new set of tools to navigate this world where information and misinformation spreads so quickly.
I think we do.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, though, I think it would be helpful to look at a couple of recent films that offer some interesting perspectives on these issues.
Okay.
Kind of like case studies for how these idea pathogens play out in the real world.
Oh, I like that. I'm always up for a good movie night.
Me too.
So what do you have in mind? What movies are we watching tonight?
So the first one is Dream Scenario.
Okay.
It's a dark comedy about a professor who becomes famous overnight, but then he gets canceled just as quickly for something he said.
Oh, wow.
It really makes you think about the fickle nature of fame and how easily narratives can be manipulated, especially online.
So it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of mob mentality.
Yeah.
Like how quickly public opinion can turn against you,
Right.
even if you didn't mean any harm.
Exactly. And it also makes you think about like this whole culture of instant celebrity that we have and how that intersects with our own desire to be seen and validated online. It really makes you wonder, are we all just performing for an audience?
Yeah,
And how much control do we really have over our own narratives?
that's a lot to unpack there.
It is.
What about that second film? What was that one you had in mind?
The other one is Don't Look Up.
Okay.
And it's a satirical take on how we react to inconvenient scientific truths.
Right.
It's about these two astronomers who discover a comet heading straight for Earth.
Wow.
But no one seems to care, even though they have all the evidence. It's like a commentary on how we just dismiss or ignore information that doesn't fit our worldview,
Right.
even when the stakes are incredibly high.
I remember that movie. It was funny, but also kind of terrifying
Yeah.
because it felt like they were talking about climate change denial
Right.
and how we as a society can be so resistant to like facing these uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. And that ties back into what Saad calls anti-scientific environmentalism, where people prioritize feelings and ideology over scientific evidence, which is interesting because they're potentially harming the environment while trying to protect it.
All this is really making me think about how these idea pathogens,
Yeah.
while often disguised as good intentions, can have really far-reaching consequences. Before we move on, what's the most important thing you want our listener to take away from this first part of our deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway here is awareness. Just being aware that these idea pathogens exist, that they can be incredibly persuasive, and that we are all susceptible to them in some way.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So we've identified the enemy, right?
Uh-huh.
These idea pathogens that can really distort our thinking and even influence our behavior.
Right.
But now what do we do about it?
Yeah.
Like, how do we fight back?
Right.
It feels a bit like that training scene from Inception,
Yeah.
where they're learning to defend their minds from those invading thoughts. How do we arm ourselves against these harmful ideas? What do you think?
I think that's a great analogy.
Okay.
And just like in Inception, the first step is recognizing that you're not immune.
Mm.
We all have those vulnerabilities, those biases that make us susceptible to being manipulated.
You're saying we have to admit we might already be infected.
Yeah, in a way.
That's a little scary.
I know, but it's not about feeling defeated.
Okay.
It's about being aware. Because these idea pathogens, they're designed to exploit our natural tendencies.
Right.
Our desire to fit in, our fear of being ostracized.
Right.
They play on our emotions, making us less likely to think critically about the information that's coming at us all the time.
So awareness is the first step.
Right.
But how do we actually start to break free? Like, how do we build up our defenses? What can we do?
One of the most powerful tools we have is skepticism.
Okay.
Don't just accept everything you hear or read at face value.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Question the source.
Right.
Consider the motives. Look for evidence. And remember, just because something triggers a strong emotional reaction in you doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
Okay, so be skeptical,
Yeah.
but it feels like we're bombarded with information these days
That's
from
okay.
all sides.
Yeah.
So how do we know where to start? Like, how do we avoid getting overwhelmed?
That's where critical thinking comes in.
Okay.
And it's about carefully analyzing information, evaluating the arguments,
Right.
forming your own conclusions based on reason and evidence, not just on emotion or what everyone else seems to believe.
So it's like being a detective, right?
Yeah.
You're looking for clues,
Right.
piecing together the puzzle,
Exactly.
trying to separate fact from fiction.
Yes.
So are there any specific techniques that we can use to improve our critical thinking skills? Anything our listener can do right away?
Yeah, absolutely. One technique is to look for logical fallacies.
Okay.
And these are common flaws in reasoning that can actually make an argument seem convincing, even if it's based on false premises.
I think I've heard of logical fallacies, but can you give us a real-world example, something our listener might encounter in their everyday life?
Okay, so one common one is called the ad hominem fallacy.
Okay.
This is where someone attacks the person making the argument instead of addressing the argument itself.
Oh, yeah.
You see this online all the time, especially in those comment sections.
Yeah.
Instead of engaging with the ideas, people just resort to name-calling
Right.
or questioning their motives.
Just like trying to discredit the person
Exactly.
rather than dealing with the actual issue.
Right. And it's a way to shut down the debate without actually having to think critically about the other person's viewpoint.
It's like they just want to win. They don't really care about the truth.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's often a sign that they're more interested in winning than actually finding the truth.
So spotting logical fallacies, that's one technique.
Uh-huh.
What else can we do to sharpen our critical thinking skills? What else do you recommend?
Another really important technique is to be aware of confirmation bias.
Okay.
This is the tendency we all have to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs,
Ah,
and we tend to ignore anything that challenges them.
oh, I am so guilty of that.
Yeah, we all are. It's human nature. No one likes to be wrong, right?
Well,
So it makes sense that we gravitate toward information that makes us feel good about our own opinions.
exactly.
But this can also lead us down a dangerous path.
Okay.
Because if we're only consuming information that reinforces our worldview, we're not open to new ideas.
Mhm.
And we're less willing to challenge our own assumptions. It creates an echo chamber where we only hear from people who already agree with us.
So how do we break out of those echo chambers?
Right.
Like, how do we expose ourselves to other perspectives? What do you think?
It takes conscious effort.
Okay.
But one thing you can do is to actively seek out diverse viewpoints. Read articles and books from authors who you don't typically agree with. Listen to podcasts that challenge your assumptions. And I think one of the best things you can do is talk to people who have different life experiences than your own.
I can see how that would be helpful.
Yeah. It might be uncomfortable at first, but that discomfort is a good sign.
How so?
It means that you're growing
Okay.
and expanding your understanding of the world.
It's like stretching a muscle.
Yeah.
Right. Might be a little painful, but it's good for you in the long run.
Exactly. And just like physical exercise, the more you do it, the easier it becomes.
Mhm.
You start to build up your mental resilience
Yeah.
and your ability to engage with more complex ideas without feeling threatened.
So all this is helpful,
Yeah,
but it can still feel really overwhelming to filter all this information that's coming at us.
I know.
Is there anything else we can do,
Yeah.
like to make it easier to spot these idea pathogens and resist them? What do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the simplest but most powerful things you can do is ask yourself, what's the evidence?
Hmm.
When you encounter a claim, especially one that triggers a strong emotional reaction in you,
Yep.
just pause for a second and ask yourself, what's the evidence to support this? Is it based on facts, logic, and reason, or is it based on fear, anger, manipulation?
I like that. It's easy to get swept up in the emotion,
Right.
especially online,
Yeah.
where everything is so, like, attention-grabbing.
Exactly.
But taking that step back, asking for evidence, can really help to see things more clearly.
Absolutely. And if someone can't provide credible evidence to support their claims, that's a red flag. It doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong,
Right.
but it does mean that you need to dig deeper, do your own research. Don't just accept things at face value.
Be more like a scientist,
Yes,
constantly testing, revising beliefs, and looking for new evidence.
exactly.
Speaking of science, you mentioned anti-scientific environmentalism
Right.
as one of the idea pathogens.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? I think our listener would be interested to hear more about that.
Sure. Anti-scientific environmentalism is basically the idea that we should make decisions about environmental protection based on feelings and ideology rather than sound science.
So emotion over facts when it comes to the environment.
Right. And it can actually lead to policies that are harmful to the environment, all in the name of saving it.
That seems counterintuitive.
It is a bit paradoxical, but it
Mhm.
happens more often than you might think.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. One example is the opposition to genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, in agriculture.
Okay.
There's a lot of fear and misinformation around GMOs,
Right.
but the scientific consensus is that they're safe.
Mm-hmm.
And they can actually help to improve crop yields and reduce our reliance on pesticides.
But a lot of people get really freaked out by GMOs.
They do.
Like they're going to turn into mutants or something.
Yeah.
Where does that fear come from?
I think there's a lot of fear-mongering around GMOs.
Okay.
Often based on unfounded claims and conspiracy theories.
Mm.
And this fear can lead to policies that restrict the use of GMOs, even when they could be beneficial for the environment and for food security.
It's like they're so attached to this idea of things being natural
Right.
that they're rejecting solutions that could actually help.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
Right.
And I think this kind of thinking extends to other areas of environmental policy as well.
Like what?
Like, there's a lot of opposition to nuclear power, even though it's a low-carbon energy source that could really help to mitigate climate change.
I get that. Nuclear power seems scary, you know?
Yeah.
Chernobyl, Fukushima,
Mhm.
those disasters
Right.
really cemented that idea of nuclear power as dangerous.
I understand. And those were tragic events.
Yeah.
But there are also outliers. Modern nuclear power plants are incredibly safe.
Okay.
And the risks associated with nuclear power are far outweighed by the potential benefits, especially when it comes to reducing carbon emissions.
So it's another example of fear overriding science and reason,
Yeah.
even when the evidence points in a different direction.
Yeah, exactly. And it really shows how important it is to be able to critically evaluate information, especially when it comes to these complex issues like climate change and environmental protection. We can't afford to make decisions based on fear or ideology when the stakes are so high.
All of this is making a lot more sense to me now,
Yeah.
but it also makes me realize how difficult it can be to change people's minds,
Yeah.
especially when they're so deeply invested in their beliefs, even if it's not based on evidence. How do we even start a productive conversation with someone like that, someone who's really dug in on their position?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's something we're going to explore more in the final part of this deep dive. But for now, I think the important thing to remember is that rejecting science and evidence, that doesn't just affect individual beliefs.
Right.
It can have far-reaching consequences for society as a whole.
So it's not just about like personal opinions.
Right.
It's about informed decisions that affect everyone.
Exactly. When we make policies based on ideology rather than evidence, we risk jeopardizing public health, safety, and even our planet's future. We have to remember that science is not just a body of knowledge. It's a process for understanding the world and making informed decisions. And when we reject that process, we do so at our own peril.
That's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
So listener, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, take a moment to think about how anti-scientific thinking might be influencing your own beliefs
Yeah.
and your own decisions. Are there areas where you're letting fear or ideology kind of cloud your judgment?
It's a good question to ask yourself.
Yeah. And be sure to tune in for the last part of our conversation, where we'll explore how to bridge those divides and engage in productive dialogue, even when we're faced with these really challenging viewpoints. Okay, so we've learned about idea pathogens, these sneaky ideas that can spread like viruses, and how to protect ourselves from them.
Yeah.
But now for the hard part, how do we talk to people who seem to have been infected? It feels a bit like that scene in Inception, where they have to go into someone's mind and plant an idea without them knowing.
It's a tough one. There's no easy answer or guaranteed method for changing someone's mind,
Right.
but I don't think that means we give up on dialogue.
Okay.
It just means we have to be a little more strategic
Hmm.
and approach these conversations with empathy and understanding.
So where do we even begin?
Yeah.
If someone's already really entrenched in a certain ideology,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like whatever you say is just going to bounce right off of them.
You're absolutely right, especially if you go into the conversation trying to be confrontational or condescending.
Nobody likes to be told they're wrong,
Exactly.
especially about something they really care about.
Right. So what's the alternative?
Yeah.
How do we approach these conversations in a way that's productive, but also respectful, even when we completely disagree?
I think that's what everybody wants to know.
Yeah. One of the most important things is to start by listening.
Okay.
Really try and understand
where they're coming from, what their fears and concerns are, and what experiences might have shaped those beliefs.
So empathy is key.
Absolutely.
But what if they're saying things that are just factually inaccurate
Right.
or based on misinformation? Should we just let that go?
I mean, that's where it gets tricky.
Right.
You don't want to be validating misinformation,
Uh-huh.
but you also don't want to shut down the conversation before it even begins by jumping in with corrections.
So how do we find that balance? How do we address it without totally alienating them?
One technique is to ask questions instead of making statements. So instead of contradicting them, maybe try to gently guide them toward critical thinking by asking open-ended questions that encourage them to examine what they believe.
So instead of saying, you're wrong,
Right.
you could ask something like, what evidence do you have?
Exactly. Or, can you help me understand why you believe that?
Ah.
Or even, have you thought about it from this other perspective?
So the goal is to get them thinking
Right.
and questioning their own assumptions, not just getting defensive.
Exactly.
But what if they just dismiss anything that challenges their beliefs?
Yeah.
Like we talked about confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
People tend to look for information that just confirms what they already think.
Right. It feels like you could give them all the evidence in the world and they'd still explain it away.
It's so frustrating.
It is a challenge, and it's important to remember you're probably not going to change everybody's mind. Sometimes the best you can do is plant a seed of doubt. Get them to think just a little bit differently about the issue.
So it's a long game.
It is.
We might not see results right away,
Uh-huh.
but over time those seeds might grow.
Right. It's like planting a garden. You nurture it, hope for the best, but you can't force things to grow.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And even if you don't change their mind,
Right.
you might learn something new.
Yeah.
You might get a better understanding of their perspective,
Absolutely.
which could help you to communicate more effectively with others who have similar beliefs.
I agree. And honestly, sometimes the most important thing is to just show them what a respectful dialogue looks like. To demonstrate that it's possible to disagree without being disagreeable, to challenge ideas without attacking the person.
That's such an important message.
It is.
Especially these days when it seems like everyone's yelling at each other online and retreating into their little echo chambers.
Right. We've gotten so used to these really toxic online interactions that we've forgotten how to have a civil conversation with someone who has different views.
And isn't that exactly what these idea pathogens want?
Yeah.
That division, polarization, and lack of critical thinking.
They spread more easily when we're isolated, only talking to people we agree with.
So by engaging in respectful dialogue, even when it's hard, we're not just challenging one person's beliefs.
Right.
We're pushing back against these harmful ideas on a larger scale. We're showing that there's a different way to engage with the world.
Yes.
One that's based on curiosity, empathy, and listening to each other.
I completely agree.
And it's not just about talking to people we disagree with.
Right.
It's also about talking to people in our own circles, our friends and family, who might be falling prey to these idea pathogens, right?
Absolutely.
It's like creating a culture of critical thinking within our own communities, where it's okay to question, challenge, and debate respectfully without being ostracized or canceled.
I love that.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I have a better understanding of how ideas spread and how to protect myself, but also how to engage with those ideas.
Right.
It's like learning to navigate that dream world in Inception.
I like that.
We've learned to recognize and defend ourselves against those invasive thoughts.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with this. The battle against idea pathogens, it's not just about winning arguments. It's about creating a culture of curiosity, critical thinking, and respectful dialogue. It's about recognizing that we all have our biases and that the best way to overcome them is to engage with diverse viewpoints and challenge our own assumptions.
Well said. So listener, as you head back out into the world, remember what we talked about today. You can choose which ideas you let in.
Yeah.
Be critical, be curious, and be open to new perspectives.
Absolutely.
And most importantly, be kind, be respectful, and keep having those thoughtful dialogues even when they're tough.
I agree.
That's how we build a world where truth and reason can win out, and those idea pathogens don't stand a chance.